in this
Awesome.
asynchronous world that we live in.
Yeah, because today's been maybe one of the craziest days at Sloan. I think there's like 5 or 6 major events. Our town hall with faculties going on right now. So want to be able to share with everybody. But again, thank you so much, Peter, for joining. Now recording. For everyone in the audience, Peter is one of the managing directors, partners. I don't know how you would describe it at Benchmark. Legendary firm in Silicon Valley, invested in eBay, in Twitter, and Yelp. Peter has been on, many of the companies that we know of today on their boards or have helped them grow. So it's extremely exciting to have him here. The session really, hopefully we can hear from Peter. He can share a bit about his background, any advice he has for our members. We're mostly made up of MBA students. We have over 550 members across Sloan and across other areas within MIT, making it one of the largest clubs at MIT. And I know we have over 60 people here today. And then the second half of the session, and if we can budget it, 45 minutes or so, maybe half to hearing from Peter, and then another half to Q&A. The way it'll go is people can raise their hands within Zoom. I'll call on them and people can ask their questions. So without further ado, thank you so much, Peter.
Yeah, it's truly a pleasure to be here. So, or virtually, whatever that means.
Of course.
I struggled to not just feel like I'm speaking to a panel of glass in these conversations, and the more interactive, the better. So I might limit my comments at the beginning here to tell you a little bit about Benchmark, maybe about who I am. And we don't like to do that very much, and so you'll have to bear with the forced nature of my description, since we have a belief that our business is best done in the background, and I'll explain why as I go through that. Then maybe I'll spend a few minutes on what advice I wish I had gotten maybe at the time I was getting an MBA in 1999, 2000. I graduated in the class of 2000. As it relates to thinking about the choices you might have in front of you between venture versus, say, entrepreneurship versus working at an established company, and then we can dive into whatever topics come to people's mind. So let me start with just my own personal story. I was born in the Silicon Valley, and it's not lost on me how lucky I was to have been born into an ecosystem which is distinguished, I think, in Silicon Valley increasingly as a place of concept as opposed to a physical place, but it's hyper connected. And my dad was a CEO of a startup company, and he despised these creatures that he either called vultures. I don't know what they was describing, these vultures, vulture capitalists, which of course was venture capital. And so I spent my youth hearing about this, species of abusive board members that would come in and try and prescribe advice. They've never had an operating role, and show up in their fancy cars and go back to the golf links. And my dad was a true entrepreneur, where you didn't make much money back then. You'd sort of take about a quarter of the paycheck as you'd get from working from an IBM to run one of these companies. And he then became a venture capitalist later in his life. And I guess there's some adage to whatever you really despise and hate, you have to be careful, because the closest thing to love is hate. And the furthest thing from love is indifference. And so if he was indifferent, he may not have been vulnerable. But he became a venture capitalist when I was in undergrad, and I was a philosophy major of all things. And he said to me something to the effect of, like, there's a way to do this job more empathetically, with more compassion, and to be more relatable to the entrepreneurs. And knowing me, of course, as my father, he said, like, there are enough deficiencies of character that you're suitable for the venture business, which is to say that I was, hyper curious, which is another way of saying, easily distracted. There's another dimension, which I don't necessarily say with pride, but of being sort of competitive. And one of the attributes of, I think, many of the successful career venture capitalists they are hyper curious and hyper competitive. And competitive doesn't mean necessarily beating the person next to you. Oftentimes, the biggest competitor we have is ourselves, and just saying, hey, can I do better? And it mostly speaks to a growth mindset. And so as a philosophy major at Stanford, I had no interest in business. And someone asked me recently, like, how did a philosophy major set you up for being a venture capitalist? And I said, well, one is that it, as much as you guys probably cringe when you hear philosophy major, because the images of a self-important windbag. And so I actually viewed philosophy as a provocation to go into any of the sub-subjects of the university and then ask the questions of why. Like, why is, for example, computer science, at the time in the early 90s when I was studying philosophy, we were in battle with MIT at Stanford with Marvin Minsky and this idea of top-down hierarchical algorithmic structures. And I was in this camp of the neural networks, which, by the way, was laughably leveled by the MIT school of thought, because neural networks at the time were just completely inadequate to do much of anything. That being said, in philosophy, you can go poke into these subjects and say, okay, what's the right theory of cognition? What's the right theory of mind, for lack of a better term? And you get asked some questions which are sort of embarrassing to ask around, everything like philosophy of biology to philosophy of life. And what I found I took from that, and I think ultimately, I do think your undergrad teaches you how to think more than anything else, was the capabilities, perhaps, to sort of have the courage to go into a new field as the outsider and ask questions around the systems. And I think this is a big thing I would take out of any education, which is systems thinking mindset, which is to separate out causes from symptoms and understand causality as best you can. Will serve you in whatever you go do in your life, entrepreneurship, running a company, or we're doing, venture. But I didn't get a philosophy major to become a venture capitalist. When I graduated, I, like many of us back in the early 90s, it's like, oh man, I got to get a job, and went to a company, Bain, which was based out of Boston at the time, and spent a couple of years there, which I don't, used to be very in vogue to shit all over consulting and say how embarrassing that I worked as a management consultant. They're the most loathsome people, only second maybe to philosophy majors. But I actually loved Bain because of the people I worked with, and I had a really good couple years, at the end of which I was very happy to leave, since I was working on as oftentimes is the case, you work in these regulated industries in consulting that are easy to get. They have a lot of cash flow, but maybe not as much critical thinking skills. And so you get paid well to show up and think. But I just was having no fun at the end, and then went to a startup company for a couple of years before going to business school. I'm giving the background only as to tell my story as to how I got into venture. Somebody gave me the advice at age 25, 26. I'd gone to, at that point, gone to Stanford Business School. And I had the instinct to say one day, wow, I would love to practice that business where you could go meet these entrepreneurs, almost like a Darwin in the Galapagos, and sit down with these exotic creatures that had evolved through these pressures of a system of random mutation, understand why they, and like you can maybe even build a relationship with them. And from that standpoint, like, it seemed to me like you couldn't have imagined a more exciting career. But I needed to go suffer for another 3 to 5 years. This is what my logic was at 26, before I could actually get a job at a venture firm. And then somebody gave me the best advice in my career. And they said, listen, if you have really a sense of awe, like butterflies in your stomach, that wonder of like, wow, that would be great for me, you got to do it. And you got to do it now. And the idea that you have to do A before B before C, it's like, just go and go get a job in venture, whatever job you can get. And at that time, it was went to a firm called Excel, which was they're still around, and I spent a number of years there with the mindset that all I want to do is learn to see if I can actually, do this job. And I'll be honest and say, in my mid to late 20s, I was pretty inadequate, maybe still am. And after 3 years of investing, I think most venture capitalists experience this. I certainly did. So I thought, okay, I'm definitely going to get fired. I just don't want to have lost tens of millions of dollars for people who are, university endowments, and like, I'm going to be blacklisted, and I can go hide somewhere in some other country, but I don't want to have that kind of big loser. So put another way, I was motivated by fear of failure in a sense, and in a sense consumed by it too, because it's very hard in venture to get a quick feedback loop. You know, you're not so lucky when you get in. They say lemons ripen early, and the really big successes take many years to build. And so, you know, in 2001, 2002, you know, I was in my third year at Excel. Of the people who graduated my class of Stanford Business School in 2000, 40% were laid off by 2001, 2002. There were 15 people that went into venture. There were 2 of us left, and I thought I was like the next to go. And you know, and I was okay with that. And, you know, I remember, this is advice again. I realized I'm using more of our time than I wanted to, but the only performance review I remember in my career was when Jim Breyer, who was the venture capitalist back then, and Jim Getz, and it was maybe still at Sequoia. He's in anyway, just finished up at Sequoia. They sat me down and they said, "We'd like to give you a review, but we want to start with you giving yourself a review." And this is before I was promoted to partner. And it was anyway. So I said, "Listen, I'm not doing great, guys. I think I take too much time to make a decision on the companies I don't invest in. I look at the greatest opportunities out there, and I think I'm only seeing a fraction of them. I could see more. So now, as bad a review as I'm giving myself, I think the firm gets an equally bad review." And so they were taken aback. It's like, whoa, like we had a much more optimistic, positive review for you, and we feel pretty good about ourselves. I'm like, no. And you know, at the time, Excel wasn't doing great, and we then recruited Kevin Effersey, who I give credit for bringing the Facebook in, and I was there when we did the Series A at Facebook. Was sort of played a small part in having made that Series A investment and getting to know Mark at age 20 and trying to convince him to take our money. Anyway, all this is leading me to Benchmark, where after 7 years at Excel, I was past the fear of failure to the point of saying, okay, you know, none of my companies had failed. I thought they would all fail. Some of them were starting to work. And, you know, I was moving through that period of like, I'm going to get an F to, you know, I might get a decent grade, not necessarily thinking about how do I get top of my class. And that whole system of thinking, a hierarchical system of like investing is performance and there's a grade, you know, was in a sense toxic, because, you know, it prevents you from really cleaning up your thinking around, okay, what is the purpose of the job? Well, it's to partner with the best entrepreneurs of any given decade, to put maximum effort into the best opportunities. And it's not about, you know, performing and getting a number or any of that, like, at least for me. So I was feeling a little discontent at Excel. Needless to say, you know, I'd risen to the top of the hierarchy. I was whatever, 30 years old. I was the, you know, in the top of that firm. And the firm that I always had wanted to work at, but had never thought I could get a job at, reached out to me, and that was Benchmark. And Benchmark then, as is now, stood for a radical departure from the traditional venture model. So it's a flat, equal firm. Partners treat each other as peers, and the firm flourishes on this concept of respect and affection for your partners. So as opposed to competition with your partners to beat them out on the return game, there was a camaraderie. You know, at the time, you know, the firm was homogenous, and which to me was a big negative. It was 6 or maybe 7 tall white men, and you know, I just thought, listen, I wasn't in a fraternity. It's not who I am. You know, I have a very different set of like personal friendships that just don't look like that. You know, and I kind of got across the threshold of that and realized that the firm is actually that yes, it was homogenous and in a way that was unacceptable from my standpoint. I'll just fast forward to today. Benchmark is 4 general partners. I'm the only white male. I'd like to keep it that way for a little while. But we have, you know, changed fundamentally, but we're still the same structure, the same culture in a sense, as we were back then. But they called me and they said, listen, the business is about working with entrepreneurs shoulder to shoulder with no overhead and designing your entire life around the purpose, which is to help an early stage entrepreneur through a decade-long journey to reach their maximum ambitions. And in that decade plus long journey, you get to partner with them when they have 3 employees all the way through 3,000 and go through the growth curve with them. And in the process, you might grow too. And that's all we do. There's no growth fund. There's no India fund. There's no, you know, none of that. It's just stripped down to the essential core. And power of the equal partnership is that it forces a set of behavioral, this is a philosopher coming in saying, what's the system? Behavioral norms. And those behavioral norms were manifest. Every venture firm has a Monday partner meeting. And at Excel, our Monday partner meeting starts at 9 a.m. sharp, maybe it was 8. And we tried to get it to finish as quickly as possible, because it was, fuck, it's a heavy thing. You sit there with your partners and you have to go around in a structured order and everybody has to talk. And if you talk too little, maybe you're not doing enough. You talk too much, then you're probably desperate and it's just stressful. And so Mondays would be like this black hole in the week. I get to benchmark my first Monday and people showed up late. They start playing, back then there wasn't YouTube. Oh, there was, but it wasn't big enough. But it was this 2006 when I switched firms. And I had almost invested in YouTube. We can talk about that. That's a whole nother story. But people show clips, the videos, laugh and joke, and then about like 2 or 3 hours in the meeting, somebody actually talks about business. So, and by the way, we're not like, we do the same thing now. We talk about different stuff given the diversity of the group. But the sense is that as a partnership, you need to have this underlying foundation of safety and security and almost something I would describe as unconditional faith in your partners to be able to have really direct, hard conversations. And, when I say really direct, hard conversations, you can tell your partner who's, on the board at Uber that the behavior of the company is intolerable and action has to be taken. And it's like we've rationalized it for too long. And that partner can hear that feedback and not feel like you're judging them, but just seek to get to, so, okay, what do we do about it? And I mean, I can give you hundreds of examples, but the experience of Benchmark and the way the model works, I discovered, which I wish for all of you on the call today, when you go through your 20s, I think you're trying to establish your purposeful trajectory in something that can inspire you to do work where it never feels like work. And you should experiment as much as you can in your 20s. I landed in my mid 20s on something which I was lucky enough to find. And I think, if I'd failed in venture, it might have been a blessing. Who knows? I would have maybe been a halfway decent philosophy professor or a teacher or something. I don't know. You can't say normatively is one path better than the other. You just can't. I will say, the power of the venture model, though, is that it does have a very beautiful career arc where over 15 to 20 year period, you can practice this job. And if you don't, quit or get fired, you can get really good at the parts of the job that I found to be super rewarding, which is less about the returns and more about the relations with the entrepreneur. If you work with enough companies, I probably work with 30 businesses now, to get to at least 50 million in revenue. I'd say 20 to 100 and about 10 to a billion in revenue, maybe 8. And that is so much fun. And I cannot convey, it's never quite the same as if you're on the management team, which I don't ever want to suggest that we can, intuit exactly what it feels like to be on the actual team. Having said that, each relationship with those entrepreneurs is as deep as any relationship you form in your life, because you're working through all the stresses of growth and fear and courage and vulnerabilities, and over time you might actually become capable, because I didn't start that way, at really unlocking the potential of the entrepreneurs you work with. And I think Benchmark, just to finish on that, is set up such that we're a $500 million fund. We have 4 to 5 active GPs at any point in time, totally flat and equal. And we have one single objective function, which is expressed as serving entrepreneurs to reach their maximum potential. I think there's a background objective function, which is to say in every 10-year stretch, there's 3 to 5 companies that break out. There's 3 to 5 companies that are going to be worth more than 100 billion, 1 to 2 that'll be worth more than $1 trillion. We hold ourselves accountable to being the partner to as many of those 3 to 5 as is possible. We make all sorts of mistakes. We did the Series A, and my partner Matt and I did the Series A on Instagram. We were the geniuses that sold it at $1.3 billion and felt like we were, we screwed that one up. But we were the Series A investors in Snap. Hopefully, people still use Snap and at MIT. And in Uber, I think Uber will get to 100 billion in value. It's not there yet, and has gone through as you probably have witnessed, a tumultuous, rocky road. But in any decade, there's going to be 3 to 5, and this decade, I think Stripe's going to be one of them. we'd like to hope we have one or two. We're not promotional people, which is why if you go to our website, you don't see anything. This is worth just spending a second on, then I'll shift it to open up to questions. When I got in the venture business, we used to always like have the at Excel, like who's going to fix the website problem. And like the website, people come to the website to see the firm, and they want to see all the successful companies you've backed, and like the videos and testimonials, and let's make it really interactive. And Benchmark was the first firm that had a website, like literally the first firm. And I would go to the Benchmark website and say, they got it right. Like, look at all those famous entrepreneurs and smiley faces and flashing logos, and like, this is amazing. They might even be using Macromedia, Flash. And so, but we had a shitty static website, so we built a better website. And then the website's got the arms race of websites, led to a whole bunch of other forms of arms race of promotion. And when we hired Matt Kohler from Facebook, who was one of our partners for the last decade, and he and I had been, I invested in him when I was at Excel, and he was the fourth or fifth employee at Facebook. Matt came over, and I said, Matt, you're the youngest partner now. Even though we're flat and equal, you got to fix the website. And he finally, like, after a few attempts to make it look interactive and social, more like a wiki or even like a Facebook page, he said, listen, the really great young entrepreneurs don't want to see their brand behind your brand, meaning their brand behind Benchmark. The great entrepreneurs want to know that they are in front, their company's in front, their customers and what they serve. So the only way to reconcile this with the entrepreneurs that we want to work with, the ones we really want to work with, is to get rid of it. And we point them to our Twitter feeds, to the other content where it's transparent, but this promotional slick thing is just antithetical to who we are. And in fact, it'll be a good litmus test for the entrepreneurs that are drawn to the flashy website with all the stuff on it versus the ones who are drawn to us. Because he said, if I look at Zuck or Evan Spiegel or the Time Travis, like, they get turned off at the promotion of these venture firms versus, like, take, for example, Instagram. I mean, I don't want to pick on Sequoia. If they were on the call, I would say this to their face. You can find Kevin Systrom on that website. Kevin Systrom took money from Sequoia and sold his business 48 hours later. But he's on the Sequoia website. So you say, okay, well, what does that mean? Like, how? And so we just like, we don't want to play the game. And then, like, what, do you not put your losers up there? You just put your winners. And what? So then we got to start getting a series of phone calls. We did this in 2012. And it was so interesting that literally a dividing line from our CEOs, above the age of 40, people called us or emailed us and said, your website's broken. Under the age of 40, universally, people said, that's the most brilliant move you could have ever possibly done. Thank God you don't have one of those terrible websites anymore. So you don't learn much about us from our non-existent website. Now, you could say transparency is an important, I get it. We are quite available. And I think part of what we do is we live that in behavior, not in talk. So let me shut up, since I probably have like rambled through some non-interesting topics and open it up. And I don't know what the best way is to field questions. But I defer to Justin, and maybe if you want to tell me how to do this, do I go to the?
Yeah, for sure. Well, first of all, thanks so much for walking through. I personally, I'm sure everyone else probably has 20 plus questions just based off what you said. Website's interesting, and for the point that we had one of the partners of Bessemer last year talk all about the anti-portfolio part of their website and all the companies they missed out on. But one question I have before we open up is, how do you think about your time and time allocation? That's something that we talk a lot about in the club. How do you think about, and beyond just investing in companies, you also have to manage the firm. So how do you think, you have only so many hours in the day? Maybe Zoom makes it easier or harder, you don't have to travel, but just curious what your philosophy is around that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really timeless, total cliche, forgive me, or I should say pun, timeless question that you can always ask yourself. And you can ask any CEO I work with, like, how did you spend your time this last month? And if you had to do it all over again, would you do it the same? And almost invariably, the answer is, I put a little too much time in the stuff that wasn't high yield and not enough into the stuff that only I could do. So a very typical thing I've done with CEOs, and it tends to happen at about arbitrarily between 150 and 300 employees, I have some form of intervention. I'm going to answer my question for myself, but starting with my CEOs, and my intervention is, okay, let's get the calendar out and get a highlighter. And we have 3 colors, like Green, this is shit only you could do. And, you know, red is the stuff that you're doing that others could do that really is actually diminishing you and making you feel worse about your job. Like, and those are, you know, there's a lot, it turns out red ends up being a lot of the calendar. And then like yellow is the, you know, you enjoy doing it, but you don't have to do it. Someone else could do it, but you enjoy doing it. And then going through asking the question, okay, how do you build a system of time that honors the purposeful weeks that you want to spend and months you want to spend? And this is did this work with Jack Dorsey when he was running both Twitter and Square at the time. And so, you know, he came up with this sort of construct, which I then ran with, of purposeful days. And as a CEO, you can have like Monday as the, you know, team gets together, check in, management updates in the prior week, Tuesdays recruiting, Wednesdays product review, Thursdays culture, Fridays, like you get the point, one-on-ones. So I used to profess that like every CEO between 150 and 300 employees has to have that structure, that system. So they know that they're going back with some recursive frequency to say, I'm actually operating in a way that's consistent with what my objectives are. My week is Monday's partner meeting, which is, by the way, a variety of things that range from checking with my partners to trying to be decisive about new investments as best I can. Fridays, I leave completely open. And I learned that, by the way, only when I got to about 15 board seats, that if I didn't have open Fridays, then the pressure in the system would explode, you know, either myself or it would explode my calendar. So having Friday wide open and telling my assistant, worked with me for 20 years now, I said, listen, it won't ever really be open, but if it is open, that's great. That's the beauty of venture, is that we control our calendar. And it is like, if you talk to people who go from operating to venture, that is the first thing they'll tell you. They'll just be like literally whiplash to say, I had no idea that you controlled your calendar and that you could actually just decide that you don't want to work on Tuesday. And yeah, you don't have to work on Tuesday. You don't want to work on Tuesday. Now, if your partners say, please meet this company, you probably got to go meet the company, but you can do it on Wednesday. And that freedom, you know, is something that I guess a lot of people hadn't felt since they were in college, because so much of a job is that there's like, you know, you got to show up and hit the mark, and you got, you know, or in grad school. So, you know, what I've tried to is sort of reclaim the time on my calendar so I can continue the job for a few more years than I would have otherwise, because it just burns you out if you don't do that. So Fridays I leave 5 open, but what I've done on Fridays, I do a lot of check-ins and one-on-ones with my CEOs. And so Howie at Airtable and I do a Friday call. Victor at Wildlife, we do a Friday call. And, you know, it could be 50 minutes or half an hour, but it's mostly meant to be reflective. And then the in-between Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, I would say right now, 80% of my time goes into working with my existing portfolio. And the three things that we do with our portfolio are strategic guidance, which is, you know, mostly asking questions. We go through org structure design, systems design. And so this is, you know, it's kind of straightforward. It's pretty simple when you describe it this way. The strategy of an organization, of a company, should be reflected in the structure, and it never is. You know, so if you're, you know, a company that celebrates radical invention and you're hierarchical and you're functional, then you're not going to get that. You have to be more general manager autonomous. And so I spent a lot of time at organizational structure, like when do you hire a head of product, a head of engineering, and how do you think about, you know, scaling the systems of the business. And the third thing we spend time with our companies, which ends up being the bulk of the time, is recruiting, which is the staff. So strategy, structure, and staff. That's the Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. 80% of my time probably goes to that, in either in a board meeting construct or just, you know, doing recruiting one-on-ones. And then a bulk of the time, that what's ever left, that 20%, is just looking at new opportunities. One of the secrets of venture that nobody will tell you, I don't think, well, if they do, they're ashamed to admit it typically. We aren't so special that people call us and want to work with us. We have to call them and ask and beg times for the opportunity to serve them. So I found that the best work I've done in venture, and this is, again, I think somewhat of a secret only because it's so obvious as to be missed by so many firms, is to sit back and not react to the flow of stuff coming your way, but rather to ask the question, what will we look back on in 5 or 10 years that is in a compounding network effect growth curve that we will deeply regret not being part of. And if you ask that question every week, every month, the answers change. But that's honestly how we got into Twitter and how we got into Uber. When I asked the question at Uber after we passed on the Series Seed, which was, a different, Garrett Camp pitched the company. Travis was the chairman. It was a terrible meeting. About halfway through the meeting, my partner who would then serve on the board says, you shouldn't, it was called Uber Cab at that time. He said, you should call it Unter Limo. You sit there, you wait twice as long, maybe 3 times as long for a big prom car, because there were prom cars back then, stretch limos, to pick you up, to pay 3 times as much as you would for a cab. That's the worst idea. And then fast forward 6 months when they got the black cars, and this is before, UberX or the Lyft business model. And you push a button, a car comes, and it would come quickly, like less than 2 minutes in San Francisco. And we asked the question of, okay, what's working? And I framed it as, if you had to delete every app on your phone, what's the last one to go that isn't supplied by $1 trillion market cap company? And Matt said, without question, I couldn't imagine living without Uber. I'm like, we got to go invest then. And so now you might say, well, that's not bold and courageous because it wasn't like, if we didn't see it before the rest of the world. No, that's not our job. Respectfully, I think people miss that venture is not crystal ball. Venture is partnering with an entrepreneur who has a radically scalable idea and company system and enabling that potential to be met. So why is that relevant? Well, because when venture starts to speculate and predict, well, this might happen if that happens, and we do a terrible job of that historically. So if you think about the biggest winners in venture, Amazon, Google, Facebook, Apple, go down the list, Uber, Stripe, every single one of those companies, before they took branded venture capital, was working. Amazon was doing 20 plus million in revenue. You might say, okay, it's tiny, but it was working. It was up and running. Yahoo going back, Cisco. And you say, okay, well, that's, if you look at the winner circle, the top 10 venture investments ever, if they were all up and running and working, then we're not threatened. I'm not threatened by seed investing or angel investing, because to me that is truly fucking random. And if you get it right, great, but you can't scale that. That is because it's just random. And you can do what YC did, and I think get a better sense for the character, the people you want to back. But make no mistake, YC is not investing in business plans. They're investing in the potential of those individuals because they seem to index high on fearsome, authentic, and technically savvy. And I look at the way I practice the business, it's that if I can find somebody that, now, a third of the investments I've made, I should be direct about this, I've been before there's any company. So 4 of those companies have gone public. So the Cloudera, Zuora, New Relic, and Elasticsearch, like literally we formed the company with those people at the beginning, so that before there was no seed investment before that. I love doing that venture work. It is so energizing, but I can really only do that in enterprise. And I can only do an enterprise when I really know the sector, and that because I've worked enough in it to know, okay, well, that's like, Elastic was going to work. Now they did have, the product had been released. So while there wasn't a company, there was an open source movement. And New Relic, nothing had been created, but I'd worked with Lou in his prior business at Wiley, and we, so I got off topic. I guess the point I'm making is, how do you spend your time? Asking that question. In any situation, I think the best work we do is when we ask the right question. Then the answer is you can actually get a shot at the right answer. But if you're not asking the right question, and I think most venture firms don't recognize that is the question of our business. If, like, in a decade's period of time, if there are 3 to 5 companies that are going to break out, you got to find a way to get involved. And I've adapted a little bit of my investing. So Airtable is an example of a company that fell into that category. And they had already raised 20 million in capital. We typically do Series A's with the first institutional money. I spent 3 months with Howie, and we came up with a new model where Howie said, look, if you're serving on the board, I'll give you shares as a director that you can invest into. And if you don't deliver what I think you're going to deliver, I'll fire you. I'm like, okay, that's fine with me. But I think Airtable has a shot to be one of those companies. And so you do everything you can to work with them. And as opposed to fussing around with valuation, and I remind my partners, and this is going to sound stupid, but it's like, well, we really need to be disciplined on price because, we risk adjusted reward, blah, blah, blah. And I said, listen, if we're investing at less than 100 million pre-money and we're getting our typical ownership stake of 15 to 25%, the only question over the long run is, did it work? Because if it didn't work, it's not going to be a great investment. And okay, we can get our cash back, maybe we get 2 to 3 times, but if it works, we're getting 1,000 times back. And that is the racket of venture, is that we have the asymmetry of like a Bitcoin cryptocurrency asymmetry. You could lose $1, but you could make 1,000 times. And if we're exposing ourselves to opportunities where the entrepreneur is not trying to just sell the business or just, but actually they have the ambitions or the probabilities that those ambitions will become manifest in success, because oftentimes you back an entrepreneur and they're like, look, we'd be happy to not go out of business. Evan Spiegel tells a story. Well, I mean, I'll give you the short form of this, which is Evan and Bobby had a number, at Snap. And they said, if we clear this number, I'm not going to say it because it's sort of, I think it'll betray their trust. If we clear this number, we're good. Like, we're done, we're happy, we got what we need. And that's pretty typical. As an entrepreneur, you sort of say, okay, you're obviously motivated by a purpose to do something and create. And, but if there's a financial outcome part of your brain that's like, it's not unusual for people to say, I'd be really happy if I got this. So then Mark Zuckerberg offers him $4 billion to the cap table, and then another $2 billion for him and Bobby that he could vest into. I think they had 15 people in the company at the time. So, that was more than his number, needless to say. And then Evans, he had 15 people, he had no revenue, no business model, he had nothing. And he reflects on this and he says, at age 23, he goes to my partner, Mitch, like, listen, I just realized that I don't have a number, because what am I going to do with all this cash other than like try and build a company that engages the world, that, puts some form of, I don't think he wants to do good in the world, but he was just like, we need the product functionality that Snap was building was like anti-venom to the venom of Facebook. It was a ability for people to freely self-express and to get out of their head, and he's like, listen, I don't want that's going to sit underneath Mark Zuckerberg. No fucking way. There's no number. And, it's interesting because he would never have answered that question that way 2 years prior. And so one of the things we discover is that with a lot of our judgment calls around character, which is how will the individual respond to the inevitability of overwhelming wealth and success, and will those trappings corrupt them? And for some entrepreneurs, they do. And we were involved with WeWork. I mean, my God, like, that guy is as pathological as you could possibly imagine, and then go further. And the stories would blow your mind. But he was also a great entrepreneur for what he did, and or the case of Travis, which is even more challenged, where our job is to sort of, if we can course correct the entrepreneur's growth towards getting better every day and avoiding those pathologies, then we've done our best work. And if we can't, we take it very personally, because I think it is part of our contract, is that an entrepreneur can know that we support them unconditionally, but we also have to recognize that if you break the law, and if you do things that are deeply unethical, we have to stand on the side of the our view of what is appropriate and correct and moral and right. And okay, so that sounds heavy, but it's I think if you don't do that, you're complacent or complicit. So anyway, those are all derivatives of the answering your long-winded answer to your question.
All good. So. Appreciate it, for sure. Okay, let's try to get a couple of questions. And I know I want to be cognizant of your time. Maybe we can say another 15 minutes. Does that work?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's maybe try to get in a few. Okay, so Akshay.
Thanks, Justin, and thanks, Peter, for speaking with us. We really appreciate it. My question is around board meetings. So given your extensive experience working with a range of different entrepreneurs and companies, what are some attributes of the best board meetings and best board members that you've seen?
So I've thought a lot about this topic, and having served, I did this math, and I think it probably is not exactly right anymore, but I've been to over like 3,500 board meetings in my venture career, and the average board meeting is 3 hours. I'm over the 10,000 hour rule. And I can't say that I've gotten better at them and that I'm practicing and all that, but I finally got to a point about, I don't know, 3 to 5 years ago where I just had enough. And I tried to summarize and distill what I found to be the most effective mechanisms for an effective board meeting. There's some things that are sort of truths that are universal, and then there's some things that are very specific to the stage of the company. So the universal truths, I would say, are the boards that are really going to flourish need to have, radical transparency, and that's done through it being a safe place for the entrepreneur to be vulnerable. And to be vulnerable, they have to believe that the understanding and empathy and compassion and their board is there to support them, not to judge them, although that is some part of the board's function. And that the board is a construct to enable their growth, and should be vested with that intent. That's a universal truth. Second universal truth is that PowerPoint sucks. So if you're in board meetings and you're staring at PowerPoint slides, to me, it's as offensive as anything you could do with someone's time, because you're not activating the board when they're staring at PowerPoints. Those are things that could be written down, communicated in advance, and then discussed. So I urge the boards I work with to have a pre-read that has all the substantive material of the business. And that means specifically is that there's a CEO letter, and then there's a section for each of the major functional parts. And this is why it varies with stage. When it's just 3 people, it's just the CEO letter. When it's 300 people, then the VP engineering has their section, the VP of so no more than 6 pages per subsection, and ideally a synthesis that you're really getting from each of those leaders. And what I found is that is a really effective way for me to identify the quality of the leaders that the CEO has, because that written material, even though the person, as Jeff Bezos said, he's a big investor in our fund, and he does the same things. We stole this in part from him. He said, even if the VP engineering, for example, can't write, I need to know that they can find somebody that can write, because if you can't be resourceful to say, then it's important that you communicate what your priorities are, what you're doing. And so the second universal truth is no PowerPoint having a big pre-read. And the third universal truth is that I try to break the board meetings into 3 sections. First section is just a chance to, in a free form way, much like our partner meetings, connect, allow the CEO to express what's on their mind, what's keeping them up at night. But it's just the CEO. The second section is usually, by the way, in that first section, you have all the business update stuff. So did anyone have any questions about the revenue, the pre-read, the this, the that? The second section, we go into a deep dive topic. And it could be that if the company's planning for its next fiscal year, that's the financial plan for 2021, or the deep dive topic could be product or sales, this go-to-market engine, whatever it might be, competitive update. And then the third section is typically, again, a closed session. By the way, that second section could be 2 or 3 subjects, could be 1 subject, but the executives that are responsible for it should come present with the CEO kind of as a listener, not presenting. The CEO shouldn't be presenting that stuff. And then the last session is sort of the closed session, which is, you get the administrivia stuff, the options grants, all that stuff usually gets done in that section. You can also do that in the first section, but it's sort of like you break into thirds. First third is a check-in. The second is like, okay, the team is performing around areas of interest, and the third section is a closed session. What I would tell you is what ultimately the really high quality boards, even the best boards, break at about 7 directors. I've never been on a high functioning board with more than 7 directors. The ideal size has been, from my standpoint, around 5 to 6. I'd prefer to have 3 than 7, though, just to give you a sense. And the really high functioning boards, you're having a rich conversation where there's high conflict, in the sense that it's not just consensus, but it's like people challenge each other, and it's safe. And 2 directors, and I'm perfectly willing to, engage and battle with my other directors where there's some pursuit of truth, and all the then critical thinking goes up, even if so even if one of us is obviously wrong. I'll sometimes not necessarily won't do it frequently, but I may take a position that I don't think is right, just to get us off of our consensus, because then everything in the organization gets improved by it. Last thing I'd say is, if you are an entrepreneur and you're trying to get the most out of your board, I say this mostly because I want other people to suffer this. A good CEO engagement with the board should have, in anticipation of every board meeting, these are the 2 or 3 things I want to get out of this board meeting, and here's my homework assignment for each of you directors. So for example, it might be, we're struggling and scaling engineering. It seems like our productivity is going down as we've gone from 15 to 30 engineers. I'd like each of you directors to give me an example and a name of a company that successfully scaled from 15 to 30 to 100 engineers, and make that person available to my head of engineering. You have to give them homework assignments. And so my old partner, Arthur Patterson, say, people don't realize that these boards are only as good as their handlers. So, when you blame and you're a victim to your board as a CEO, and that's on you. So you have the ability to drive what you want out of your board and challenge them. And if you're not getting what you want out of your board, then you redesign your board. So.
Thank you.
Yeah. Awesome. Evan.
Thank you so much, and appreciate your answers so far. So I'm very interested in the value add of a venture capitalist, especially from that 10-year life cycle standpoint. And I think you kind of spoke to it on the intangible side of it, with the the intervention between 150 and 300 people of, okay, let's think about your week, and that interpersonal with the CEO. I'm curious as to, because I think that a lot of venture math, especially early on, is either simple or made up. A lot of the value add can be negotiating term sheets and having that perspective. And so my question to you there is, what are some terms that people don't really spend enough time on? Everyone talks about valuation, ownership, and all that jazz, but what are some terms that you really like to look at, especially as you go through those different cycles? And then a second is, what are your thoughts on the limits of the venture capital realm that you're in, as opposed to venture studios or search funds or all the different flavors that are out there?
Yeah, let me see if I can answer those questions with some precision. I play them back first. So the first question is, what are the terms that are underappreciated in their severity or their importance? What matters at the end of the day in success is dilution. And I don't say that because it's, we deserve whatever we buy. I don't know. It's an open market. We have a set of alternatives, sort of entrepreneurs, and so you negotiate what honors both of those constraints. But what I'm amused by, almost like in a very negative way, amused, disappointed with, is the corruption of cap tables, with lots of investors who are going to eat up precious ownership and not do much to support the company in return for it. So when people raise seed rounds followed by, or angel rounds by seed round, pre-seed, I mean, what the fuck is pre-seed? So the next thing you know, like 10% of the company's gone out the door, with people who aren't going to be there. In the 2 fundamental ways in the cap table you have to assume for support. One is that, like, if your investor is on the cap table, but they only write 1 check, that is liability. Because when you raise the next round, and sometimes it's not so easy. And trust me, I've been through 2, 3 major downturns. And if your investor's like, listen, I'm out, like I put my money at the beginning, and then you got to go fill that hole. That's why corporate investors are so dangerous in my view, because the corporate investors never write a second check. They're like, whoa, we did that, and the guy who did that's not here anymore. So dilution is the most important thing for everybody to be talking about, and so little time gets spent on it. It's amazing to me, relative to other topics. Secondly, I think that in terms, the things that we do, since we're early stage investors, typically, we do the first institutional money, is the sins of the parents are then, inflicted on the children, which is meaning anything you put into a term sheet for your round may feel good as an investor, but it's going to come back at you the next round. So we don't do seniority, for example. There's no round the senior. We don't do participating preferred. We don't do, and these are things which historically were in the business in model, but it's like, okay, well, if we do this, the next firm, it's not just because we don't want to have it done to us. It's just like, if you don't need to do it, like ultimately, I don't know. We play the game in a maybe different way, and gets to your second question. What we care about is like, what will the company be worth after it's public for 2 or 3 years? That's what matters to us. That's where and from a return standpoint. So if we're negotiating participating preferred as a way to make a return, you'd be kidding me. It doesn't matter. Like, I'll tell you, in a fund of 30 companies, the average benchmark investment period is 3 to 4 years, 30 to 40 companies, more like 30 companies now. If it's a good fund, one of those investments is going to return the fund. And it won't be because we have participating preferred or lick pref or this or that. It doesn't matter. What will matter is, do we have enough ownership so that when it reaches potential, it could return the fund? And if it's a really good fund, we'll have 2 firms, 2 companies, 3 companies, 4 companies to do that. But then there's all these other investments you make that basically keep the lights on, where you don't want to have a huge hole. But the alchemy of the business is that you can buy 20% of, it sounds crazy, but you can put $10 million in and get $8 to $9 billion out. Where else can you do that? I mean, really, it's ridiculous. You think about it. So to negotiate these little terms, it's like, Now, recently, a big topic has been founder control, and there's been a lot said about that. What I found is that it's usually the wrong topic. So founders that are obsessed with controlling their board and making sure that they can never be removed. And Travis had controlled his board. He could never be removed. He set it up that way. When he did the deal with the Saudis, that was the structures that and so. And the reason I'm saying that is not that no one takes delight when that happens. It's just that the forces of serving a higher purpose, the success of the business, the real constraints that you run into when you scale, all that tends to overwhelm board control. And if you're having a discussion around board control, usually something is so fundamentally broken that isn't the ultimate that's not the conversation. The conversation is more about, okay, well, fundamentally, what are we going to fix here? And anyway, I share that because I think people overly index that question of, like, if you're thinking about that, then it's so dysfunctional. Steve Jobs didn't have board control. Jeff Bezos didn't have board control. But anyway, people, Zuck has it, and Larry and Sergey have it. So the last question, I guess I'm just trying to play back, which is, where are we relative to search funds, or I don't know, like the
You also yield that to someone else, because I know that we're coming up on time. Happy to give that over.
No, let's we can finish off with this question. I think it's great.
Well, look, traditional Series A venture is a early stage venture. Was the only thing that existed when I got into the venture business in 1996. There were a few, that's not true. There were a few growth funds, Meritech, others that were doing, but most firms looked the same. There were 5 to 7 partners. Now the question of, like, a lot of them had principals and associates. Benchmark was unique in just having a flat equal partnership. Our peer set, which is think whomever you want to think of, in the last 15 years, built multiple stage funds or funds that serve multiple stages and geographies. Our belief is the best business of them all over the long run, not necessarily year to year, but over the long run, is early stage venture. And that if you build your systems completely aligned to that objective, where you're the partner of choice for the best entrepreneurs for that given Series A investment, that we can offer to them the continuity of a 10-year relationship, in some cases 15 plus years, and experience and playbooks and know-how for the evolution from one stage to the next, so that they have a continuity of somebody, a partner who both understands them, has the rich context, has the shared values of their success. And I think that product is the single best product for an entrepreneur who's seeking to reach their full potential, but also not, to minimize dilution. And what's interesting is, you look at the best investments, the best companies, really, they had that relationship. So Amazon had that with John Doerr at Kleiner. John did that with Google too. Mike was there as well from Sequoia, although John endured over the long run but that's true with Facebook. It's true. Anyway, so my theory is that, and I continue to, we sort of practice it, that's a unique offering in the market. And, doesn't mean that other firms can't offer early stage venture and take that 10-year journey. They just do a lot of other stuff. And I think that that's ultimately not always going to serve them as they think about time and day, hours allocated to the highest purpose, which is serving entrepreneurs.
Awesome. I personally, again, appreciate you being here. I'm getting comments in the chat, how everyone's really enjoying hearing from you, Peter. I would say our group is probably made up of 3 different areas. We have aspiring investors, we have Bain consultants or recovering consultants, and we have entrepreneurs. And for the entrepreneurs here at MIT that want to build, or in the process of building, my question is, how could they work with you, or what advice would you have for them to be, potentially a great partner with Benchmark down the road?
Yeah, I am. The door's wide open. We do like to call versus being called. That doesn't mean that I'd say, I don't know, maybe a third of the investments I've made, have been people reaching out to me versus me, cold calling. The advice that we will give to entrepreneurs, particularly when they're picking in their venture firm, their primary relationship, is that we're the employees that you can't fire. So, it's a relationship, it's not a transaction. And, investing to get to know the partner is one thing in a process when you're raising money, because it becomes a bit of a, that dance, right? Where you're talking to 2 to 3 firms, you've got your idea. And I see it happen every week, watching it constantly and amused, I guess. Again, I say this in somewhat amused, not necessarily in a positive way, that people are missing, entrepreneurs in particular are missing some things that they should be looking for as cues in those decisions around who to work with. And it's like anything when you look at behavioral economics, like, are you weighting the right variables when you make a big decision like that? And historically, I think people overweight extrinsic variables. They overweight, big brand names, flashy things, and underweight what I think is the most substantive thing that you want to be doing if you're an entrepreneur raising money from a venture capitalist, which is referencing, calling the people they've worked with, and don't let them curate the list for you. Although if you want to do that, that's fine, but you got to call around. You got to call 5, 7, 10 people and get a full picture of the person that you're going to work with. And that advice is something I'd say to any entrepreneur that Benchmark, and I can go back to, we just made an investment in a company out of LA. It's not announced, and all of our peers wanted to do it. So it was a beauty contest, as we say. And, everyone told their story as to why their firm was better. You get the point. It's just people are selling. And I, remember saying to the entrepreneur, that's no way to make a decision, because what happens when the sales process is over in 6 months, when you're trying to make that critical hire, is the character of the people you've chosen to work with. And the only way you're going to know that is by looking at their body of work. And I happen to believe, and I've been lucky enough to do this job for 20 years, I've left a pretty big body of work to go introspect and say, okay, when do I do my best work? When do I not do my best work? And so it's not so much a binary decision. There's like a good firm and a bad firm. It's a fit question. And knowing that you're invested in understanding that, when you have to, sometimes you have days or weeks to make a decision about a 10 to 15 year relationship. So how do you compress that time with the most amount of information? Reference. And I'll tell you the same thing when you hire somebody. And oftentimes I deal with as I said, a super majority of my time is working with CEOs hiring. And I'm always struck by how much weight they put on the interview. And I said, in the interview, you learn how well someone interviews. And my experience is that somebody who has a lot of experience interviewing has a lot of experience looking for a new job. And that's not necessarily what you want. What you want is somebody that you can reference and get a full picture of that individual and intuit how you can best work with them. And we just hired a great VP at one of our companies, I think. And I felt good about this. And it's like, okay, so let's go do it. I said, well, we haven't really gotten a reference that's not super positive, which means we should continue to do some referencing. Well, no, we've already decided we want to hire the person. I'm like, this is your chance to have 6 months of accelerated learning on what this individual needs to flourish. And if you're, and so we did, sure enough, we found a reference that said, here are the major issues that this person had at this one job, and to be watchful, mindful of, and not to sort of look for the smoking gun, but rather say, okay, how do we activate this person's full potential? How do we avoid their traps? And I think that's true for your investors as much as it's true for your people you hire that you can fire. And anyway, hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, for sure. Again, thanks so much. Hopefully down the road we could have you on campus at MIT. But in the meantime, appreciate the opportunity to see you over Zoom.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. And it's a pleasure to see all of you, and appreciate the great questions.
Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.